Hello, and welcome to the pre-concert talk prior to the second concert of the Reno Phil's 2020-2021 season. I'm Chris Morrison. I'm a producer for KUNR and KNCJ Public Radio, and I also write the program notes for the Reno Phil, and I'm very happy to be here to talk about our concert with Laura Jackson, the music director and conductor of the Phil. Laura, thank you for being here. Glad to see you again.
Hello, Chris. It's wonderful to see you again.
So the 2020-2021 season wasn't probably the one that you envisioned 2 or 3 years ago, but adapting to the times, you have a concert under your belt about which I heard nothing but just enthusiastic praise from people. How do you think it all went?
I thought it went fabulously. I was just proud of everybody. I was enormously proud of the musicians for the way they adapted to the socially distanced kind of setting. We were all so spread out and in masks and everything. And then also to the whole team and working with the new technology that we had in the hall with the cameras and the microphones and everything. And it was a wonderful way to celebrate getting back together again and making music, even in adverse circumstances.
And for your second concert, you've chosen a dance theme. Tell us where that came from.
Yes. Well, it's just always fun and wonderful to focus on what music and dance have in common. And that is just, rhythmic pulse and vitality, and then lyrical gesture, be it the shape of a melody or the gesture of a hand. The fascinating thing about this program, as I put it together, is the variety of the pieces. I love juxtaposing these 4 pieces next to each other, and the fact that they still all have these components of lyricism and rhythmic pulse in common.
We're going to be talking about the pieces in reverse order. So we're going to start at the end with a composer that has become increasingly familiar to Reno audiences very happily, Jennifer HIGDON,
Yes.
and a piece called Dance Card. Tell us a little bit about it.
So, well, first of all, Jennifer HIGDON is a composer that I've worked with many times in my early career. When I was assistant conductor with the Atlanta Symphony, we were commissioning her works fairly frequently, actually, and performing them. And I had the enormous benefit of being in the recording studio with her when we would record her pieces. So I got to know her well, how she thought. I would be sitting in the hall next to her while we were looking at her score and rehearsing the world premiere. And I just came to respect her so much. The detail, the craftsmanship, the just intensity with which she crafts and molds sound is such a wonderful thing. And then also the outpouring of soul, of emotion in her music making as a composer is just really, really wonderful.
And it seems like the world has caught up with that. She's won a Pulitzer Prize already. She's won at least a couple of Grammy Awards.
Yeah.
And her music is being performed all over the world now.
Yeah, it's really, really wonderful. We did her piece, Blue Cathedral, several years ago. And that piece alone has had 600 performances around the globe. So that's kind of rare for a new piece to get that kind of play. So anyway, it's great to be bringing another piece of hers to our audiences. And this one is really a celebration of music, a celebration of dance, and a celebration of the string section of the orchestra. So it features only strings. And it's 5 dances. They all have very playful names, and several of them are very playful dances. And then the rest of them are either lovely serenades or quite deep and thoughtful, soulful music, as in the Celestial Blue.
Yeah, even the title is sort of playful. The Dance Card, as she explains it, it's simply, she was referring back to her grandmother and the fact that when you went to a dance as a woman, you would have a dance card, and men would be assigned dances on the dance card. And it was a good way to hang a sequence of dances into a concert piece.
Yeah, that's a really hilarious thing to imagine. If a lot of people wrote their name down, you would never get a rest. I can't imagine. So the first movement is ROCKUS RUMPUS, and this is a playful, very joyous fanfare for the strings. Usually we have fanfares that are for the brass, and it's kind of fun to have one for a string section. This one, what I love in here is the way that she divides the strings into multiple voices, and it adds texture and richness to it sounds like we have twice as many people on stage as we actually do, which is kind of fun. And there's just tremendous energy in the music. Let's hear an example from this first movement. So we have a lovely serenade. The Breeze Serenade is the second movement. It's actually one of my favorites. And the Jumble Dance, which is just playful and rhythmic and just, it's just good fun. Then we have Celestial Blue. Now this is dedicated to her father.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, it makes me hearken back. Maybe it's just because I think of music history constantly, but if you go back into the late Renaissance Baroque period, there is a composition type that was around for a couple hundred years called a tombeau, which is related to our word tomb. But it was a piece written as a memorial for someone important to you who had just passed away. And it's interesting that the tombeau was always in a dance form. And here, once again, in Celestial Blue, Jennifer Higdon, in the midst of a dance piece, is writing a dance, but it's also a very touching memorial to her father, and hearkening back also to the death of her brother a few years back. She borrows a little bit of the composition that she wrote, I think, 20 years before on the death of her brother.
Yes, indeed. There are so many beautiful musical elements in this movement. She has a pulsing sort of heartbeat. It's a repeated note that'll be in the second violins, and then it moves around the orchestra and sort of reappears from time to time. And then her melodic writing, she brings solo voices. There's a solo string quartet, and it's like ribbons of melody that emerge. So it'll start in the cello, and then it sort of bubbles up that Ruth will take it in the first violins. And they just literally seem to sort of spiral around in the air as these lower sort of currents of orchestral tutti are happening underneath. The other thing that I love about this movement is when it's working toward the final climax, it reminds me of Scheherazade, Rimsky-Korsakov Scheherazade. And the reason is the entire orchestra is moving in waves. They're moving up and down the scale, and there is something so momentous and stirring. It really feels like waves of the ocean. It's wonderful.
Let's listen to a short segment from that movement, Celestial Blue. And then the final movement of the piece, we heard ROCKUS in the title of the first movement, and that's the usual R, A, U, C, etc. But we get a different ROCKUS in the last movement, ROCKUS. And MACHINA ROCKUS is the name of the last movement. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, this one is a fascinating one to put together because it reminds me of a machine, like with all these little spokes and things that are fitting together, wheels fitting together. And it's very intricately sort of pointillistic as notes move around the orchestra. So I'm expecting it to be fascinating to rehearse.
And probably fascinating to perform as well. Here's a little segment from that movement. So that's Jennifer Higdon's piece, which you'll hear at the end of the performance. Right before that, we're going to hear from another of the most popular classical composers in the world today, and that's Osvaldo Golijov, and a piece called Last Round. Talk a little bit about Golijov, then we'll get into this last round and what it actually means in terms of the music.
I can't wait to do this piece. Golijov is another composer that I worked with quite a lot at Tanglewood when I was there as a fellow, and then when I was with the Atlanta Symphony, again, in the recording studio, sitting next to him with his scores, and I just love the way he works. Utterly different from Jennifer Higdon, very improvisatory, changing things all the time, but just equally imaginative and just full of genius. So, he's an Argentinian composer. What he's doing here is crafting a piece in homage to Astor Piazzolla, the greatest legendary tango composer.
So Golijov was born in Argentina, and he was very close to, in fact, Argentinian musicians in general revered Astor Piazzolla, the great master of the Argentinian tango, who was ubiquitous around the world, really. He was very popular. He passed away in 1992, and Golijov seemed to think that was sort of the end of an era to some extent in terms of Argentinian music. And so he was inspired to write a piece that is informed by the tango, but also informed by a particular aspect of Piazzolla's background. Apparently, Piazzolla was a fairly combative individual. He would get into fights occasionally. And Golijov put all of this together into a piece called Last Round. And the last round is referring to the round of a boxing match. He was actually inspired by a short story that he'd written. And tell us a little bit how the music is put together, because it's really kind of fascinating.
Yes, this is fascinating. It is in two parts. The first is very fast and energetic and tango-like in its accelerating and intensification of energy. The second part is an elegy. And so it's just a beautiful and slow, warm, romantic, and just sort of ends very, very quietly. Now, what he's doing, Osvaldo, is putting this together, imitating a bandoneon, because Piazzolla, as well as being a brilliant tango composer, was also a performer of the bandoneon. And this is the accordion-like instrument that had buttons instead of keys, and you would squeeze it, back and forth. So he describes in his program note to this piece, he describes Piazzolla standing with his chest out very erect and squeezing the box, and everything about his aura was like a tango dancer. And that when he crafts this piece, The Last Round, he has the two string quartets. They are standing as musicians do in a tango orchestra. There is one single bass player in the V between the two quartets. And Osvaldo describes that they are, in some ways, the two quartets are like dance partners, but they're also in a duel, in the same way that the dancers, when you watch professional dancers dancing the tango, it's a risky, fast-moving, almost violent kind of dance in the jagged motions. You really have to commit to what you're doing, and you could really, if you don't know what you're doing, you could kick somebody in the shins pretty hard. So Osvaldo talks about the bows flying in the air, and the way the antiphonal nature of going from one quartet to the next is really going to be thrilling to watch as well as to hear.
Yeah, he even suggests that you might see the bows of the musicians as they're moving as the legs of dancers, as they are contesting one against the other. You can hear a little bit of that in this excerpt from the first movement. You'll actually hear the sort of back and forth between the two string quartets with the bass right in the middle. One of the pieces in the first half of the program is a very famous excerpt from a very famous piece of music, The Swan, taken from The Carnival of the Animals by Camille Saint-Saëns. And the history of this is kind of funny. We often imagine composers being inspired one day and saying, yes, I'm going to write a symphony today. I'm going to embark on a concerto. Sometimes the circumstances are a lot more mundane. In the case of Saint-Saëns, he had just finished a concert tour which hadn't gone particularly well and decided to hang out in an Austrian village for a time. He was supposed to be working on his big Symphony No. 3, the Symphony for Organ and Orchestra, which is now known as one of his most famous pieces. But he didn't want to work on it. So he was amusing himself and passing the time, writing little portraits of animals, which became this piece, The Carnival of the Animals. He didn't himself take the composition very seriously, didn't even want it published during his lifetime, yet now it is among his most popular pieces.
I love that this brilliant work is his procrastination project.
Pretty much.
You know? It's really pretty neat. So, you know, I can't help when I hear this melody, but to think of a beautiful swan gliding through the water. And it's beautifully written for the cello. It's going to be played by Peter Lenz, our principal cellist. And, you know, one of the greatest assets of Peter's playing is his big, warm, golden sound. And I just can't think of anybody who will do a more beautiful job on this solo than he will. We have a very, very special guest joining us as a dancer for this performance of The Swan, and that's Martina Young. Martina lives here in Reno, but she is a renowned dancer, scholar, writer about tropes, metaphor, symbolism regarding the swan in cultures worldwide. What she's doing for this performance is she has choreographed a dance, and we're going to see that original choreography in this performance. When I first called her and invited her to do this, I was immediately blown away by her depth of thought about the swan and all of the ways, all of the things that we imbue the swan in its grace, in its you know, beauty, its picture, the way it moves, everything about it. It reflects on who we are as people all over the world and as cultures. And, you know, to think that she's going to wrap all of that into her very own creation of a movement piece and then premiere that this weekend is incredibly exciting to me.
One of the special guest artists for this Reno Phil performance is a person who is very well known to the Reno musical and arts community and has actually become known around the world, and that is Martina Young. Martina, thank you for being here and talking with us.
Thank you, Chris. It's a pleasure to be here.
For those who are not familiar with you and your work, could you give us a little bit of a biographical sketch, where you come from and what you are currently up to artistically?
Certainly. This is my 32nd year in Reno, Nevada, and I'm originally from Los Angeles, and I was brought here through the Nevada Arts Council and through the university. And I'm currently teaching in humanities, though when I first arrived in Reno, I was invited to take the directorship of the dance program at the university. So I have been both in the dance discipline at the university, but also touring as a dance educator in rural Nevada throughout the entire state.
And one of your recent projects, which we're going to be getting into because it's connected with the piece that is featured on the Reno Phil concert, is the Swan Project. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, the Swan Project is driven by my interests in the symbolism of the swan in world cultures. And I'm just recently back, Chris, from Australia, where I was investigating the black swan. Australia is both home and habitat to the actual black swan. And the work that I just recently finished, about a year now, is an opera poem, what I call an opera poem, one of my most ambitious works, with a cast of 8 artists, storytellers, singers, poets, and dancer. And the work is now going to be reimagined with a cast of Australian artists, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous artists. We were just mentioning a bit ago that when Saint-Saëns was writing The Carnival of the Animals,
he was basically just amusing himself, writing some attractive portraits of animals that he loved. And one of the most famous, maybe the most famous excerpt from the Carnival of the Animals is the swan.
Yes.
I don't know that Saint-Saëns was actually thinking too deeply about the symbolism of the swan. I think he was just imagining this beautiful creature gliding along the water. But being the sort of multifaceted Renaissance person that he was an archaeologist, interested in history, wrote novels and so on, he would have been fascinated by the background of the swan in cultures all over the world that you've been discovering through this. I know it would probably be the subject of an evening-long or longer presentation, but give us a little hint of the symbolism of the swan as you've discovered it in world cultures.
Well, having just returned from Australia, some of the indigenous cultures there are, the black swan is their totem, is their medicine animal, so to speak. And so it carries the symbolism of care for the environment, psychic and emotional nourishment. And one of the informing elements for me as an artist is the fact that the swan seems to carry a place and time that is an in-between time, a place of being neither here nor there, but in an in-between place, a very quiet place, a self-contained place from where one can reminisce, one conjures memory, but also that's a view going back. There's also the view going forward. And so there's a sense of, in this in-between place, we're able to look back in order to go forward in our lives. Yeah. And so that particular element has informed me as an artist with this new work.
What aspects of all of what you were just discussing came into the dance that you created for this particular performance?
The elements of quietude, the elements of memory, the ideas of memory, but also an acknowledgement of loss. I think that given our time right now, what we are all experiencing in the world, it's important to take pause and to acknowledge the pause in a creative way. And that's what this particular time and this opportunity to create a new work to Saint-Saëns The Swan has given me. And those are the themes that I found enriching my choreography for the work.
I know I and everybody else who is watching is really looking forward to seeing your performance. Thank you very much, Martina.
Thank you, Chris. A pleasure.
We have the enormous pleasure of beginning this concert with a feature for our Reno Phil harpist, Marina Roznitovsky Oster. And she is just a brilliant addition to this community. She teaches at UNR. She's been playing with the Phil for years. She teaches privately and performs all over the place. Whenever we have her play, be it in the orchestra for Rachmaninoff or Tchaikovsky, maybe in the pit playing the Nutcracker or the wonderful Waltz of the Flowers, whatever it is, it's always superbly played and just beautifully expressive. And I'm so happy to, spotlight her, have her up front, and do something of a Debussy-like concerto for the harp.
You've enjoyed the performances of our next guest, Marina Roznitovsky Oster, with the Reno Chamber Orchestra, with the Reno Phil, at the stage of Nightingale Concert Hall and elsewhere in the university, and many other places. And we are very pleased that she is one of the soloists in this Phil performance. Marina, thank you for being here and talking with us.
Thank you for having me.
Why don't we start with a short biographical sketch for those who have not heard from you before. Give us a little bit of your background and what you are up to currently in terms of teaching, performing, and so on.
Sure. I started music when I was about 5 years old. My mom is a pianist, and she taught me to play. About when I was 12, I got introduced to the idea of playing the harp, and I really liked that. And I thought my mom was joking when she suggested that because I was so busy, but I said yes, and then a week later we took a lesson, and that was it. My harp teacher was wonderful. She became like my second mom, and really I grew to like it quite a bit. And then I didn't think it would be my career, but it ended up my career, and I couldn't be more grateful for that fact. I've enjoyed really every moment of the journey. I got the, I moved from Ukraine to Israel, from Israel to Indiana when I went to study at the university. And from Bloomington, Indiana, I moved straight to here, Reno. Never heard of it before, but I came to visit and I loved the place, and I thought, why not? Let's see. And it ended up being a great fit for me. And I've been teaching at the University of Nevada, Reno for the last 13 years and playing with the Reno Chamber Orchestra, Reno Philharmonic. And right now I still do a whole lot of teaching, because that's what people do when they're in quarantine. They play music, and it really keeps all of us slightly more sane, being able to create music, and thank goodness to technology that we can do some of it remotely.
Are you able to actually teach in person, or are you having to do pretty much everything online now?
Partially. With a few people that I'm more comfortable with, I do in-person lessons at my house. There's plenty of space. Sometimes we do a lesson outside on the porch if it's a good weather. But a lot of the lessons are on Zoom or FaceTime right now.
And you're performing with the Reno Phil as a soloist. And in a piece, we were talking a little bit earlier about how composers very frequently don't set out to write a masterpiece. Sometimes it's just a very practical sort of thing, like Saint-Saëns not wanting to write his organ symphony and just sort of passing the time procrastinating, writing Carnival of the Animals. In the case of the Debussy Sacred and Profane Dances, the origin of the piece was actually sort of a practical situation with the construction of the harp, wasn't it? Can you tell us a little bit of that story?
So back in the time when Debussy was about to write this piece, he was commissioned by a company that was making a type of harp. It was called a chromatic harp. And chromatic harp was sort of a new thing, and there was a rivalry company that was making a pedal harp. They were both chromatic in a sense, but the chromatic harp, also called cross-strung harp, had crossed strings and no pedals involved. And the pedal harp, of course, had pedals and only one set of strings. And the different companies commissioned Ravel for the pedal harp to write Introduction and Allegro, and Debussy was commissioned to write harp, a concerto or concertino, and it was called Dance, Sacré and Profane. We know who won because the pedal harp is the one that we widely use today. But it was a very interesting harp creation back then that had a fair chance to compete.
Was Debussy setting out to create a piece that would show the capability of this new harp, the fact that it had easy access to all of the notes of the chromatic scale?
Indeed, and it fit very well to Debussy's writing, with all his extended chords and sort of juxtaposed harmonies. And on the pedal harp, it has quite a bit of pedal work to create the same sonorities smoothly. But on the chromatic harp, yes, all the notes were in front of you, sort of like on the piano, and you could have access to all of them.
On the harp that you perform in the present day, does Debussy provide any specific challenges to you or difficulties?
Yeah, anytime performing a concerto really comes the debate about projection and the abilities of the harp and the volume of the harp as it sort of competes with the orchestra. So in any large orchestral writing, it's always a challenge to be able to project and to have a good balance with the orchestra. But specifically with Debussy's writing, it is a very gentle sort of almost contemplative writing. It's based on a chant. The first movement is based on a chant. So how do you project while staying very soft and gentle with your playing? That is really the big challenge with Debussy.
Now you have to answer the question, how do you do that?
They're being very sensitive, I would say, to the balance between the instrument and the orchestra. The writing, the orchestration is done very well. So it does allow us to have sort of a conversation. There's never a moment that the orchestra, the way it's written, really doesn't overpower the harp. But still, to be able to have a clear projecting sound to the back of the hall is always a matter of sensitivity.
So I understand you're going to demonstrate for us a little bit of your harp and what we're talking about in terms of how it produces the notes that it does.
Yeah, so the harp is very interesting because when you watch it from a distance, you might not even realize that it has the pedals. And in order for people to see first that there are and how many and how they work, we have to bring the camera all the way around and zoom in. And this is the wonderful thing about this setting is we can do that. So I would be happy to show the audience up close how the pedals work. So the pedal harp has 47 strings, and they're tuned sort of like the white keys of the piano. And in order to create the other sounds, I have to adjust the pedals. There are 7 pedals, one for each note of the scale, and they're all connected inside the column of the harp to a very elaborate mechanism that has more than 2,000 moving parts, and it's called the action. This is where all the action happens. So let me show you what it sounds like and how it looks like when I move my pedal from flat. I'm going to use the C strings. From flat, it's going to be this long, and when I move it to the natural, a set of discs will move and create half a step higher sound. And if I move it again, the next set of discs will move all across the harp. All the C's will sound a half a step higher again, sounding like a C sharp. So every string can create 3 different sonorities: flat, natural, and sharp. And you will see me move the pedals quite a bit in some of those passages in Debussy dances.
We hope you enjoyed this introduction to the music that's going to be performed by the Reno Phil. Now, along with enjoying this talk online at YouTube or in podcast form, by subscribing to Inside the Music, the Reno Phil podcast, this presentation will also appear right before each of the performances by the Reno Phil. On Saturday, November 7th, the concert begins at 7:30, and you can see this talk at 7 o'clock. Or on Sunday the 8th, the concert presentation's at 4 o'clock, and this talk will air right before it at 3:30. Thanks very much, and please enjoy the music.